Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Mary Hartnett, and I am the Executive Director of Clean Elections Minnesota. Clean Elections Minnesota is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works for a healthy and inclusive democracy in Minnesota. Among our goals are keeping and expanding voter access and limiting the power of big and dark money in our political process. We at Clean Elections Minnesota, along with our co-hosts for this evening's discussion, the League of Women Voters Minnesota, Fair Vote Minnesota, We Choose Us, and the ACLU of Minnesota, have successfully backed some common sense ways of making voting easier for eligible citizens in Minnesota. That's why we are concerned about the threats to voting rights of all Americans contained in both President Trump's March 25th executive order and the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Bill, or the SAVE Act, which was passed last month by the U.S. House of Representatives. Tonight, we'll learn more about what both would do if successfully enacted. I should also point out that legal challenges to the President's executive order have been brought by the League of Women Voters USA and the American Civil Liberties Union and 19 states, including Minnesota. We have two top authorities on voting rights to discuss the threats posed by the SAVE Act and the President's executive order. Steve Simon is in his third term of overseeing Minnesota's elections as Secretary of State. In that time, he's worked hard to expand voting access and to encourage Minnesotans to vote. Prior to becoming Secretary of State, he served 10 years in the State House of Representatives and played a key role in many Minnesota election reforms. A lawyer, Secretary Simon has also been an Assistant Attorney General and had a private law practice. Joining him is Deirdre Schifeling, the ACLU's Chief Political and Advocacy Officer. In this role, she leads the organization's national and state-level policy and campaigns teams, national grassroots organizing infrastructure, and electoral programming. Before joining the ACLU, she held key advocacy positions in the White House and with the Planned Parenthood Federation of America. She began her career as an organizer with the United Steelworkers. Moderating tonight's discussion will be Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and CEM board member Dave Hage. And last, thank you to the Minnesota Commission of DeafBlind and Hard of Hearing for providing CART and interpreting services for tonight's webinar. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Dave.
Thanks, Mary, and thanks to everybody who's joining us on the webinar tonight. And thanks also to Deirdre Schifeling and Secretary Simon. Thank you for joining us tonight to help understand what's at stake in this really serious issue at a rather troubling time for our democracy. Deirdre, perhaps I could start with you. Could you just tell us two or three key provisions of this legislation, the SAVE Act, and why they seem troubling to friends of democracy?
Yes, and thank you so much for having me on. This is such an important topic, and I'm really honored to be here with all of you to talk about this. So the so-called Safeguard American Voter Eligibility, or SAVE Act, has three provisions that are particularly troubling. The first provision that we're hearing the most about is the requirement to present documentary proof of citizenship in person just to register to vote. This would disenfranchise countless eligible voters and cause upheaval to voter registration systems and election administration. It also adds unnecessary and significant new barriers to voting. It requires a person to provide documents to prove their citizenship in person to their election official every time they register to vote, even if they move to a county over and re-register to vote. Acceptable documents would include a birth certificate, a valid U.S. passport, naturalization paperwork, and certain versions of the Real ID that indicate citizenship, which is not available yet in most states. So voters would need to have those accessible and show them in person to their elected official. And I just want to say this would especially disenfranchise voters of color Some estimates say that only 30%, for instance, of African American voters have a US passport. So this is going to have an especially onerous impact on voters of color. Second, the SAVE Act requires voter roll purges that we know will lead to erroneous removal of many eligible voters. So the SAVE Act mandates these purges that are extremely dangerous because they don't even require notice to the voter who is being purged from the rolls. This will lead to many voters being purged with no notice and people showing up surprised on election day that they are not on the rolls. Right now, the National Voter Registration Act has protections on notice and protections on timeline that prevent purges too close to an election. That's part of how we make sure that purges are not being done for political purposes. But the SAVE Act would just negate that and really supersede it. And then finally, the SAVE Act also charges election officials with a crime, with a prisonable offense of up to 5 years if they register someone to vote without sufficient proof of that person's citizenship. So these are like election officials trying to do their jobs. Even if that person is actually a registered citizen, the election official can be charged with a crime if they don't have adequate evidence or proof. So, we believe this is no way to run our elections. This bill is a disaster, and we strongly oppose it.
Thank you. Secretary Simon, is there anything that you would add to Deirdre's comments, or could you talk a little bit about how the SAVE Act would affect elections here in Minnesota?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm blessed to be with you tonight. It's always an honor. And thanks to everyone who's watching. I think Deirdre did a masterful job of summarizing really the key points of this bill and why it's so harmful. I will just say this, though, on a sort of a note of grace to at least start out with. I think it's important for all of us to at least acknowledge that on the surface, there's good reason why a lot of people might find this appealing. On the surface, at first blush, at first glance. It's not ridiculous that someone who hearing this argument for the first time might say, hey, there aren't that many things you need to be an eligible voter. I mean, you've got to be 18, you've got to live where you say you live, and you've got to be a citizen of the United States. Those are sort of the big three. So what's the big deal asking for someone to show papers or show some reason why they meet all those criteria? It makes a certain sense on the surface. But like a lot of things in this area, and I suppose in a lot of areas, the more you look, the less you like. And as I think Deirdre did a really good job of explaining, it's a lot more complex than that, and it's going to have real world impacts. These aren't just theoretical, as I think we're going to get into a little bit later. We have experience in this area in parts of this country, and it's been a real disaster. And so it really has the potential to shut out millions, that's not an exaggeration, millions of Americans who can't produce the papers that are required. One example that has been much in the news, but it bears repeating here is, we have 69 million women in America who have a different last name now than they were born with. Mostly, as you can imagine, due to marriage and a choice to take another name. Over 20 million of those 69 million do not have a passport. So what would they do? What would someone do in that situation? Well, that person would most likely have to produce at least 2 documents. A birth certificate, number one, and number 2, some kind of marriage record. And that's if the person has only been married one time. If they've been married more than one time, it might be multiple marriage records. And we know from experience, and I know we're going to get into this later, how harmful that can be and how many people will be shut out. And when I say people, I mean eligible people. Eligible Americans, red-blooded Americans, just like anyone else who's American on this call. Eligible Americans, millions in the United States, stand to be shut out if this ever were to become law.
I'd like to stay on that point because Secretary Simon raises a great point, which is this is going to seem like an innocent, common sense piece of legislation to a lot of citizens. Deirdre, let me turn to you. You touched on the difficulty that some people would face in producing these documents. Could you elaborate on that? I mean, some Americans, some folks might find it hard to believe that we have a lot of Americans, millions of Americans, who don't have a driver's license or don't have a passport or don't have a birth certificate. These seem like sort of ordinary documents to many, many people in our country. Why is that not the case? And how many does it affect?
Yes, it's a great question. I mean, Many people do not have these various documents for a variety of reasons. I mean, Secretary Simon just indicated one of those reasons, which is you might have a name change due to marriage. You might have a name change due to changing your name or having, a different gender identity than you were born with at birth. There are lots of reasons that could be the case. Getting a passport is onerous. It's expensive. It's time consuming. The only people who are doing that are people who are planning to travel outside the country. So there's a class element. People who are privileged enough to have the resources to travel outside the country are more likely to have passports. Proof of residence. People who are lower income are more transient. They move more frequently. They are less likely to have documents that have their current address on them. So this has a big impact on people who have lower incomes. The other thing I would say is this has a big impact on people who live in rural areas or on Native American reservations. These are people who are, it's more of a hardship to travel in person to these different locations. I'll give you one example. My colleague right now is in Alaska, actually talking about the SAVE Act right now as we speak. There are people who, in order to comply with a law like this, would have to take an airplane to go to where their election official is and show their documents. So, it's people have different circumstances, and it's a very onerous requirement.
Yeah, great. Just to continue on that topic, supporters of this act and this type of legislation, because it's sort of been in the works, different efforts for several years now, argue that voter fraud is rampant in America, that sort of anybody can walk into the polling place on election day and just sign their name, put down an address. Secretary Simon, could you talk to us about what the facts show, what the research shows nationally and in Minnesota about the actual incidence of voter fraud?
Yeah, happily. Well, let's talk about Minnesota in particular, and let's talk about this particular species or type of voter misconduct, which is non-citizens voting, right? That's what this is all purportedly about. It's about making sure we don't have non-citizens voting. We only want citizens to vote, which of course we all do. 100% of us do. Here are the facts in Minnesota. Fortunately, we have fresh evidence and fresh facts. Last summer, the summer of 2024, a professor at the University of St. Thomas Law School in the Twin Cities did a study and a paper and an analysis of exactly this issue in Minnesota. He looked at 10 years worth of voting in Minnesota from 2015 to 2024. During that time, 13.4 million Minnesotans cast ballots. Okay, so those are the numbers. 10 years, 13.4 million ballots cast. Do you know how many instances he found in Minnesota of people who are not citizens voting? The answer is 3. 3. And if you don't believe me, you can Google it. He wrote an op-ed summarizing his findings in the Minnesota Star Tribune, and the paper is out there for anyone to see. 3. Now, that's 3 too many. Every one of us on this call wishes it were 0, me most of all. But come on. 3 out of 13.4 million. That's as near to perfection as you can really get without being, in fact, perfect. So that's the kind of scope that we're talking about here. And it's overkill. You don't want to shoot at a mosquito with a machine gun, right?
Yeah.
That's what this is.
Right.
In an effort to catch maybe 3 people over a decade, we're going to shut out tens of thousands of people per election in Minnesota. No rational person, I think, would do that. Again, I understand the overall appeal on the surface, but once you dig just a little bit below the surface, you discover just how much overkill this really is. And it's dangerous. It's going to shut out a lot of eligible voters unless we push back and defeat this thing.
Great, thanks. Deirdre, I'm going to turn to you. Us folks in Minnesota are very proud of our state. We think we're above average in most things. So let me ask what the national data shows on voter fraud, on non-citizens voting. Is the data similar across the whole country?
It is similar. This is a non-issue. For the most part, that is being turned into a sort of a false issue. I think the real issue is that not enough people are voting in this country. That is the real problem. So only 65% of eligible voters voted in this past presidential election. 65%. 90 million people didn't vote. Only 73% of eligible voters are even registered to vote as of today. So that's 72 million people that are not registered. So people really being disenfranchised in this country is the real problem. And this is really what our lawmakers should be focused on trying to fix.
Great. We have a question already from our audience, and I'm going to turn to Secretary Simon for this because it's a great question. Again, a lot of people have the impression that anybody can walk into the polling place, sign their name, and get away with voting. In Minnesota, what protections do we have? How does somebody register to vote, and what safeguards do we have to make sure that they are in fact eligible to vote?
Yeah, many, many, many. Okay, so let's zoom out for a minute and talk about what voter registration even is in the state of Minnesota. In the state of Minnesota, in most places I know, voter registration means two things. It doesn't mean 20, it doesn't mean 8, it doesn't even mean 3. It means 2. The two things it means is the voter has to show that they are who they say they are, and they live where they say they live. That's it. That's the whole thing. In Minnesota, of course, we have a long and flexible list of things you can use to show either or both of those things. So that's to start with. Then when you go to the polling place, of course, you have to give your name. Sometimes they follow up with an address as well. And what you're speaking to is this idea of voter impersonation, right? That someone can go in and claim they're Jane Doe or Joe Blow, and they can just be given a ballot and vote right there. It's called voter impersonation. I've been in this job now for a few years. In Minnesota, by law, every single law enforcement jurisdiction at the county level, all the county attorneys, they have to report to our office not just conviction level data, not just charging data. They have to regularly report to our office investigation data, whether or not it even results in a charge, let alone a conviction. So we get all the data from the beginning to the end. And in all the years now that I've had this job, I have not seen, maybe there was one and it escaped my attention, I have not seen a single case of voter impersonation. The penalty is severe in Minnesota. It's a felony. It's also a deportable felony in Minnesota. So we have multiple checks and balances. Those are just some of them before, during, and after elections that will catch people who do the wrong thing. It happens very occasionally. It happens rarely. It's at a microscopic level, particularly as we're talking about tonight. Like I said, 3 people out of 13.4 million over a 10-year span. So it's pretty vanishingly small, and that's in large part because we have the laws in place and the procedures in place to catch, and more than just catch, to repel and prevent people from doing the wrong thing.
Great. Deirdre, is anything that you would add on that same topic? You know, the safeguards that we already have in all the 50 states to ensure clean elections and voter registration.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is we have the safest, most secure, most reliable election system in the world. It is the envy of the world. And that is in part because it is a distributed system. It's very difficult to hack. There's a lot of safeguards built into it. And we should be so proud of it. And this idea that we don't have safe and secure elections is a myth. We do. There's not a problem to solve here.
Great, thank you. I'd like to turn for a moment to the president's executive order, because in addition to the SAVE Act, which has passed the House pending in Senate now, in addition to the SAVE Act, President Trump has issued an executive order that would have, I believe, similar consequences and requirements for voting. Deirdre, could you just discuss that executive order for a moment?
Yes. So this executive order tries to achieve some of the similar harms as the SAVE Act and would also disenfranchise many Americans. In some ways, this executive order goes further. For instance, there's a directive in the executive order that DOJ obtain and review public voter rolls from each state. We've never seen that. There's also a directive to the Department of Justice to use subpoena power if they need to acquire a state's voter rolls. This data provision is being challenged in pending lawsuits, so we'll see how this piece of it turns out. But what I'll say about it is, while some aspects of voter files are public, we don't trust either the motives or the competency of DOJ in terms of why they would want all this data about voters and what they might do with it. We are worried that they could use this data along with other incomplete federal databases that they have access to in order to try to force states to erroneously purge voters from the rolls. These databases are not primed to talk to each other and could ultimately result in voters being improperly flagged for potential removal from the voter rolls. So because of that high potential for disenfranchisement, we are going to be monitoring this very closely. And, the other thing I'll just say about this is we don't believe that the president has the power to enact this executive order. The president doesn't have the power to dictate the terms and conditions of elections in this way. That is left to Congress and to the states. So we feel confident that this executive order, or at least parts of it, are not going to go into effect.
Let me just elaborate on that for a moment. As Mary said in her introduction, the ACLU and the League of Women Voters filed suit to block the president's executive order. Two questions. Deirdre, let's start with you. Secretary Simon, chime in if you'd like to. What's the status of that litigation right now?
Yeah.
And what are the odds that it goes to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court rules that, golly, the president does have this authority under the Constitution? Where are we at on the lawsuit right now?
Yeah. So we at the ACLU are very proud of this litigation alongside our coalition partners at the Brennan Center to represent the League of Women Voters in this case. And earlier last month, my ACLU colleague, Sophia Lynn Lakin, who leads our voting rights litigation project, presented arguments in court on this executive order. Then just a few weeks ago, the federal judge in this case issued a preliminary injunction on the portion of the executive order that we argued, the portion that would require documentary proof of citizenship to register to vote on the federal registration form. So this is a big win in stopping for now that portion of President Trump's executive order. The exact next steps in this case are a little unclear, in part because the Department of Justice has not been proactive in its response to this preliminary injunction decision. The court at this point has set a scheduling conference for June 18th to evaluate what the next step should be. And obviously we'll keep fighting this if we need to, but we're hoping that this preliminary injunction will stand and this piece of the executive order is blocked.
Secretary Simon, anything that you would add on that litigation?
I would. There are multiple tracks of this litigation, and the track that the ACLU and the League of Women Voters and others are on has been the most successful and the quickest so far. As you heard, they've already gotten an injunction on a major chunk of it. But Minnesota has joined about 18 or 19 other states at this point in another separate track of litigation. And exactly as Deirdre said, our sort of threshold initial argument is, you don't have this power, President Trump, to do this at all. If you look at Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution, it's pretty clear. It says states are in charge of the time, place, and manner of elections, except that Congress can step in. Congress can step in. It says nothing about a president of the United States waving a magic wand in the Oval Office and purporting to do a bunch of stuff. One of the things that hasn't come up yet about this executive order is it purports to order an independent federal agency. It's maybe one of the most interesting and important agencies you may never have heard of, called the Election Assistance Commission. And it orders this independent agency, which is made up of 4 commissioners, 2 of each party, by the way, for a reason, because it's independent. It orders it to do certain things that are best left done by Congress, like the SAVE Act. It basically orders this EAC, Election Assistance Commission, to change the federal voter registration form to require proof of citizenship. Now, I don't like the SAVE Act. But if you're going to do that kind of thing, the proper way to do it is to pass a law, go through Congress. You can't just wave a magic wand in the Oval Office. One other thing that it does, and this is as much political as anything, it says right in the executive order that states will be cut off from certain elections-related funding unless they comply with this executive order, unless they do things that the administration likes in elections. They'll be cut off. That's what it says. That's what it purports to give the president the power to do. So our track of the litigation is focusing heavily on just that authority issue, among other issues as well. Just that, as an initial matter, you can't do this. The stuff you want to do is best done through an act of Congress, not just by fiat in the Oval Office.
I hate to ask you to speculate on what's going to happen at the U.S. Supreme Court and what the justices are thinking, but I'm going to ask anyway, because the president has tested the conventions of constitutional authority repeatedly in the last few weeks. What are the odds that the Supreme Court, Deirdre, let's start with you. What are the odds that the Supreme Court might find in his favor on this and decide that he does have this authority to change election rules?
Well, I don't want to bet. I don't want to be on the record. But what I will say is, just to sort of echo the secretary, we're confident President Trump does not have the authority to do this, and he does not have the authority to do a lot of things he's attempting to do, both in this voting executive order and in many other venues. The ACLU, since the start of the Trump administration, has filed 58 lawsuits against the Trump administration on a variety of issues: birthright citizenship, the gender marker on passports, which I saw a question about in the chat, lots and lots of different issues, including this voting executive order. And generally we win. And generally we win, even when it goes to the Supreme Court. And the reason for that, not always, not every time, but generally, the reason that we win is, and I think that we will win in this case, is the elections clause in the Constitution is clear. As the secretary just said, only states and Congress may set the rules for federal elections. And the president does not have this power to unilaterally rewrite election laws. Congress can pass a law like the SAVE Act, which we feel confident with all of your help, we will block from passing into law. And the president theoretically could sign that. But that's not what happened here with this executive order. This is the president acting unilaterally in an area where he has no jurisdiction. The mandates in this executive order, like requiring documentary proof of citizenship, mandating that all states must receive all mail ballots by election day. This is rulemaking that is within the power of Congress and the states to decide. So if the Supreme Court is going to follow the letter of the law and the Constitution, there's no other decision that they can make but to strike down this executive order.
Right. Secretary Simon, anything that you would add on that point?
Well, predicting what the Supreme Court's going to do is a dangerous game, especially these days. So I agree. I'm going to try to steer clear of predictions, except to say one possible result is that they will do sort of a checkerboard approach. They might say, that there are certain things in there that the president does have the right to do and certain other things that he doesn't have the right to do. I feel most confident about the sort of mini SAVE Act provision. Again, if you want to do something like require proof of citizenship, that pretty clearly to me requires an act of Congress. You can't just order an agency to make it so. So that's the one I'd say I feel the most confident about, probably, of everything in there, at least the high profile issues. But we'll see. It's going to take a while for it to wind its way probably to the Supreme Court in any case.
Okay. Thank you. We're starting to get lots of good questions from the audience, and so let me turn to a couple of those. Deirdre, somebody asks, what effect, if any, would the SAVE Act have on voters who are voting from overseas, who are filing absentee ballots, who are maybe in the military? Does this make life and voting harder and voter registration harder for those individuals?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And it also adds a lot of unnecessary administrative burdens to the people who need to administer these elections. So the SAVE Act would preempt state law. So whatever your state laws are that you have in place for same-day registration, for vote by mail, for whatever your laws in your state may be, those would be preempted by the SAVE Act, and would really put very unnecessary burdens to verify these documents in person, to make sure that all mail-in ballots are received by election day, this kind of thing on states across the country.
Right. Secretary Simon, let me turn it back to you, because we also have a question from the audience about, and if you want to talk about military, overseas, absentee voters, please do. But we have a question more generally. What would this legislation, if it passes, how would it affect our procedures here in Minnesota? And would it make it harder to administer elections in Minnesota?
Yeah, it would make it much harder to administer elections in Minnesota. And let me just pick up a thread from the previous comment, which is think about just third-party voter registration efforts, right? This would make it much, much more difficult to do something like that, or online voter registration. Right now, if you go to our website, mnvotes.gov, you can register. It takes you 2 or 3 minutes. You have to provide certain information. As I mentioned earlier, information that shows that you are who you say you are and you live where you say you live. Those are the only 2 things that we really care about. But now, with something like proof of citizenship, you would need to go somewhere and show someone something, some document, and they would be put in the uncomfortable and unfamiliar position of being sort of the birth certificate cops, right? So you'd have to go somewhere to a county courthouse or a county building or a city building or the like. For Minnesotans who are on this call, you may remember the name of a legislator who I served with when I was in the legislature and just retired after this last election. His name is Dean Erdahl, Republican from just outside the Twin Cities. And he often told the story that his birth certificate says baby boy Erdahl. Okay. Now, that probably doesn't occur with great frequency, but what would happen in that situation? We're putting our county and city elections administrator to be in the place of being sort of the judge or arbiter about whether this is his birth certificate or not. That's a real world issue. I don't pretend that that's super common, but it's an example of the really awkward and unfamiliar position that we're putting folks in. So whether it's online voter registration, which for many, many people simply could not be accomplished, you'd have to go somewhere, whether it's third-party voter registration efforts, overall, it's going to make this whole process harder. Not to mention, in Minnesota, we enjoy and have for over 50 years, same day or election day voter registration. I think it's the jewel in the crown of our election laws. We were one of the first, early adopters in 1973. I think we would see a lot more confusion and possibly delays in polling places for people who are attempting to register in person on election day in their polling place. And we haven't even gotten into the costs. And I don't just mean the cost in terms of hassle and headache. I mean the actual monetary costs for counties. They're telling us in Minnesota so far that they're very worried about the costs for them in personnel, in technology, in other aspects of the process, which are just going to be a lot more expensive if this thing were to pass. It's putting them in a position they're just not familiar with and not fully and wholly, equipped to do.
Great, thank you. We're starting to get a lot of great questions about some of the troubling procedures, such as purging voter lists and so on. And I want to ask you about experience in other states. But first, a more general question, again from the audience. If we think about the people who are most likely to be disenfranchised, to have trouble registering, would it benefit one party over we're a nonpartisan organization, so we're not pointing fingers, but does the data show that it would benefit one party over the other? Deirdre, do you want to try a stab at that?
I am going to take a stab at that, but I don't have data in this case, aside from the most recent election results. So what the most recent election results, I actually was just in a presentation today about this. What it showed is that what is called non-college voters, so voters who don't have a college degree, who are more likely to be impacted by a law like this, are overwhelmingly trending Republican. So interestingly, I'm not sure that this has like a really clear partisan advantage for the Republicans who are advancing it. Lower information voters, non-college educated voters are swinging heavily Republican, and it will disenfranchise those people the most. The other group that will be severely impacted are young people, people who are in college, who are split. So young people are not just kind of knee-jerk Democrats anymore. They are split by gender. And young men are trending more religious, more Republican. Young women are trending less religious, more Democrat. We have a 13-point gender split right now across the electorate, and it's even higher when you just look at young people. It's like 22 points. So that is a shockingly big gender gap. So I really think it's nuanced in terms of who it's going to impact. Bottom line, it will disenfranchise millions and millions of voters, eligible voters. And so that's what we care about at the ACLU. The ACLU is nonpartisan. And what we care about is the impact on people's ability to vote, no matter what their party is, no matter who they are.
Right. Secretary Simon, back to you. Would you like to elaborate on that issue?
Yeah, I would. I mean, just to use, again, a Minnesota example here. One of the reasons that a lot of us are so concerned about, just to pick one example, Native American communities. You have the phenomenon in many Native American communities that those of a certain age don't have a conventional birth certificate at all.
Yep.
That's one issue. Another issue just has to do with physical place and location. So we've been looking at the maps in Minnesota. If a person lives on the Boys Fort Reservation, which is the Chippewa Nation in Lake County, Minnesota, so on the North Shore in Minnesota, in many places in that reservation, if they had to go to the county seat to actually register or contest some sort of challenge to their registration, that's more than 2-hour drive each way. Each way. And you can well imagine that anyone in that position, Native American or not, might just at some point, given everyone's busy life, say, to heck with it. Not going to bother. This isn't worth it. And so that in itself is a defeat for someone who wants to use their voice and use their vote. So that's just one example of one demographic, but it's one that we're hearing a lot about.
Great, great. Deirdre, earlier you touched on one provision of the SAVE Act, which would affect purging of voter rolls. We have a question from the audience, a double-barreled question. One is, how would you find out if your name had been purged? And if I'm already registered in Minnesota or any other state, would I have to re-register under this law?
So there's no requirement written into the law that a voter be notified and given time to remedy whatever the problem is that they are getting purged for. So I think the answer is it might depend on state. I don't know what your state law is exactly in notifying voters when they're about to be purged, but there is not a requirement written into the federal law that voters be notified, be given time to remedy. And we've seen a troubling trend. There was a pretty well-publicized situation in North Carolina with a state Supreme Court judge whose election, won her election, fair and square, by 700 votes. That election was recounted twice, and her opponent then challenged 60,000 voters after the fact. 60,000 voters, and tried to say they weren't eligible to vote after the fact, after the election, after 2 recounts, in an attempt to try to disqualify them and say they weren't eligible voters. They didn't have the right documentation. Eventually, 6 months later, that attempt was finally quashed and put to bed. But this is the kind of thing that a law like this opens up. The idea that people can be purged, that your voter registration is not secure, and that politics could be involved in whether or not you vote. Also, the other thing that's very concerning about this purge provision is there's not a time limit. Generally, states have time limits. You can't purge right before an election, right? Because then you might just purge all the people from the opposing party. There's no protections like that written into this legislation. So I think it would depend state by state what one might do if one finds out that they are purged, but there's no obligation to notify voters.
Right. Secretary Simon, let me take it back to you. Two questions. What provisions does Minnesota have to notify voters if they've been purged, and would those protections survive? And also, I believe a bit earlier, you said we already have experience from other states
Yeah.
Of how disruptive some of these provisions, including voter purges, can be. Could you elaborate on those
Sure.
points?
Let me start with that last point first. The state of Kansas already did this. In 2011, the state of Kansas basically passed its own version of the SAVE Act, requiring for non-federal elections, all non-federal elections in the state of Kansas, documentary proof of citizenship. So the mirror image of the SAVE Act, but instead of federal elections, it was for everything that's not a federal election. So they've done this. We have experience and we have something to compare it to. Before a federal court ultimately struck down that law, they had an election. And in that election, 31,000 Kansans, eligible Kansans, eligible. I just keep wanting to emphasize that. These are as eligible as any of us on this call are eligible to vote, okay? 31,000 people in the state of Kansas were shut out because they couldn't come up with the documentation. They couldn't show their papers to show that they were citizens, even though they were. They were eligible voters. Now, Minnesota is about 2.5 times the size of Kansas, so you can do the math. That's many tens of thousands of people in Minnesota who would likely be shut out. And if you spread that out to the rest of the country, it's at least a couple million people, eligible people who would be shut out. Now, as for purging, federal law requires all states to do something called list maintenance. That's the very boring title for what it is. It doesn't always result in what's conventionally thought of as a purge. In Minnesota, for example, we don't truly purge. We don't remove someone entirely from the record. What we do is, after 2 or more elections, we, under certain circumstances, can move someone from active status to inactive status. That's what we do. But it's not a full purge like some other states do or like you've heard about in the news. But what concerns me is what Deirdre has talked about, which is the preemption of all of this. So we have a great law in Minnesota that, yes, does require notice, does easily allow people to get back from inactive to active status. It's not a full purge. But if what Deirdre's saying is correct, and if this is allowed to prevail, it would mean that the federal government and this new standard would likely preempt or overrule or override what we do in Minnesota. And that's the primary concern here. So we've got a good law that's good to voters, but it won't matter if it gets obliterated by the SAVE Act.
Great, thank you. We have several questions from the audience about trust in elections, and in particular, what we can do as average citizens to promote trust in elections, promote the system, and to stop the SAVE Act. First, a couple of other questions, very quickly, detailed questions. Deirdre, let me turn to you. Someone has asked, would the SAVE Act affect local elections, city council, school board, and so on? And secondly, what are the prospects that it would pass the Senate, and what's the timing there?
So we don't know the timing in the Senate. It has not been scheduled for a vote. Our goal is to make sure it never gets out of committee. This is a piece of legislation that would be subject to the filibuster. And so there would need to be 60 votes in the Senate to pass this piece of legislation, unless something totally unheard of happens, which is never impossible, but we don't believe that that is likely to happen. And we feel confident that Democrats are not going to vote for this thing because they understand everything that we just said about why it's so harmful and how it would disenfranchise people. So we don't have an exact timeline. It was just voted on in the House. It passed out of the House in April, and it passed out with four Democratic House members voted yes for it, which was very unfortunate. We worked hard to try to limit that to as few as possible, and actually flipped some Democrats who had previously voted for it, not understanding the full impact of it, to no votes this time. But 4 Democrats did vote for it, but we don't anticipate that any Democrats in the Senate will vote for it. The Senate has never voted on this. And Minority Leader Schumer has indicated publicly and repeatedly that Democrats will hold strong and vote no on this. So we feel confident that this is not going to get out of the Senate.
Okay. And very quickly, would the SAVE Act affect local elections, school boards, libraries?
Yeah, my understanding of the SAVE Act is this is your ability to vote. So I think this is about whether you are registered, are you on voter rolls? So yes, I believe, but I'm going to defer to Secretary Simon here, that it impacts elections generally.
Right. Secretary Simon, could you address that question?
Yeah, this is a fascinating question and one that we explored this last legislative session. There was talk about whether Minnesota or any other state could sort of somewhat legislate around this. In other words, if a court determines that this only applies to federal elections, could we somehow, if we needed to, legislate around this to sort of build a firewall around all the non-federal elections? Now, that would be awkward. And there are other states that have that awkwardness. Arizona is an example. If any of you know the law in Arizona or have lived in Arizona, they have a two-tiered system right now, which is that for they have the reverse. For non-federal elections, they have a SAVE Act situation where you have to show documentary proof of citizenship, but not for federal elections. So you have the situation in Arizona right now where some voters are eligible to vote in federal elections, but not eligible to vote in the non-federal elections because they haven't been able to show their proof of citizenship. We'd hate to think that Minnesota would ever get to the point where we'd want to be that weird, confusing two-tiered state. Our tentative conclusion was that if the time came, God forbid, that is a strategy that we would think about pursuing, which is walling off the non-federal elections in Minnesota to basically preserve the status quo of not having to show your proof of citizenship.
Great, thank you. Several people in the audience have asked tonight what we can do as ordinary citizens to stop the SAVE Act, to stop this type of interference in voter registration, what sort of message we could be sending to elected officials to stop this. Deirdre, could you take a crack at that? What can the ordinary citizen do?
Yes. So you can definitely reach out to your senators. You have two excellent senators, Senator Smith, Senator Klobuchar. You can reach out to them and urge them to vote no and tell your friends and family to do the same. You can also reach out to your House member, check and see how your House member voted, and either send them a thank you for voting against it or send a message of your disappointment. And share how the SAVE Act would impact you personally. How would you and your friends and your neighbors be impacted by this bad law? And then the last thing I'll offer is you could join the ACLU's People Power list for updates, for actions on the SAVE Act. We have a continual campaign running to put pressure on the Senate at this point to vote no on the SAVE Act, so you could be part of that. We also have some popular education sessions coming up in Minnesota that you could be part of. So there's lots of ways to get involved in the fight for democracy. And you can go to aclu.org and join People Power to join that volunteer list.
Great, thank you. Secretary Simon, would you like to elaborate on that?
That's a great list. I would agree. Contact your senator and your House member. And it doesn't matter. Sometimes people say, oh, well, she's already with us. We don't need to do that. No, that provides them the sort of ammunition, so to speak, that they need to be able to say, I got 10,000 people who reach out to me about this. My constituents really care about it. But so don't stop yourself just because you're convinced that your senator or your House member is with you. I think sending that email, making that call, sending that letter, whatever it is really important. I would say the other thing is talk about some of the things we talked about tonight. I mean, I don't pretend this comes up all the time in casual conversation, but you never know, right? We all have friends, relatives, neighbors who might see things a little differently than we do. And they might be among those who, understandably, as I said at the outset, understandably on the surface and at first blush are saying, what's the big deal? Why is everyone so up in arms about this? I mean, there's only 2-3 things you got to show to even be a voter. I mean, why shouldn't someone have to show it? Say some of the things that we talked about tonight. Talk about how in Minnesota, 3 people out of 13.4 million in 10 years. Talk about the 69 million women who have a different last name, over 20 million of whom don't have a passport that shows the proof of citizenship. So talk about that stuff as well. And finally, I would say, support organizations like Clean Elections Minnesota and the ACLU and the League of Women Voters and the others who are standing up and standing up against this legislation and the executive order and other things. So, whether it's financial support or other kind of support, it's really important that we have the grassroots organizations that are doing the hard work, that have the big microphones and megaphones and membership, and who can get the word out in really effective and creative ways.
Great, thank you. I'm going to wind things down in a moment and turn to the larger issue of trust in elections and cynicism in America today. But first, I have to add, someone in the audience just wrote in and said they went to the website to find out how you get a birth certificate or a marriage license. And I guess this is Minnesota. It would cost $66 to get a copy of your birth certificate. And I think in some places you have to get it notarized as well. So to some people, $65, $66, who cares? But to a lot of people, that's real money, money they could spend on something else. And the hassle factor that you mentioned before. But let's talk about trust for a moment. The polls show that, more broadly than simply voter registration, more broadly than simply these allegations of non-citizens voting, polls show that still a large number of Americans believe that the 2020 election was stolen and that President Biden won illegitimately. There's just widespread doubt and cynicism that we have fair, free elections in America. What can the average person do to help rebuild that trust? Deirdre, can I go to you first? How do we get our trust back in our democracy?
Yeah, I think part of it is by being active in your community and by being a voter and talking about voting and, really rebuilding relationships with your neighbors, with the people that you see every day. I think part of what has happened for a lot of different reasons in our country is the erosion of trust in institutions, the erosion of trust in the media, which has been like a real calculated effort, I think, on the right to erode trust in the media, and eroding trust in elections. And I think the antidote to that is actually building relationships locally with your neighbors, with your friends. When I go to vote, I live in Tacoma Park, Maryland. When I go to vote, I see my neighbor down the street, who's the person who's checking me in to vote. I stand in line with other neighbors. I stand in line with my kids, friends' parents when I go to vote. Like, it's a community experience. And, I trust those people. I trust those people around me. So I think the answer is really local. Of course, we need to push back on these allegations of voter fraud. But honestly, I think the more you talk about voter fraud, the more people think there is voter fraud. And the better thing to do is not engage this fake problem that's been invented, but instead talk about how you're proud to vote, how you're excited for the elections, how your neighbor is the election clerk, and really kind of just rebuild that sense of trust across the community.
Great, thank you. We're down to our last few minutes. So Secretary Simon, I'll give you the last word tonight. What are your thoughts on how do we rebuild trust? And what can the average person do to say we do have a good democracy, a strong democracy, and we should be proud of it?
Yeah, well, thanks. In Minnesota, we're in a much better position than most. Last fall, the Star Tribune did a poll that found 79% of Minnesotans have basic confidence in our election system. That's a really high number. It's hard to get 79% of Minnesotans to agree that water is wet these days, right? we feel so polarized sometimes. So that's a strong number, but that still means 21%, more than 1 in 5, have the opposite view, that they don't have confidence. And that number is too high. So what can we do? Well, I know what we're trying to do in our office, which is be sort of radically transparent about the election system. Come on in, be an election judge, watch us kick the tires at the local level. But the other thing that I think we can all do is just talk about the fundamentals of the system, very basic things. Like, for example, in Minnesota and in most places I know, and Deirdre actually mentioned this earlier, it is by design a decentralized system. So for the people who think that I or other secretaries of state are rigging, fixing, and stealing, we don't count votes ever. We don't lay a finger on anyone's ballot. That all happens in literally thousands of places across the state of Minnesota. And who are the ones counting the ballots? Your friends and neighbors. It's not the deep state. It's not a cabal. It's not part of a conspiracy. It's 30,000 election judges. That's a small army in Minnesota. 30,000 election judges overseen by a comparatively small number of elections administrators. They're the ones who are doing the work. It's your friends and neighbors who are counting the ballots. It's spread out. It's decentralized. No one person has too much control or influence. And so the idea of rigging and fixing and stealing, again, I'm talking about Minnesota, which is what I know best. It would be extraordinarily difficult. So just some of those basic facts that everyday folks might not know. You're picturing me or our office in some big warehouse, counting the ballots. We don't do that. We post what other people count, but we don't count the ballots. We have multiple in Minnesota, as I mentioned earlier, checks and balances and assurances before, during, and after. And even when that's all over, it's every citizen's right to go to the courthouse steps. So if you don't trust what I say or your county elections official says or the city clerk says, it's everyone's right to go to court and challenge those results. You don't have to believe us. We have a good grand tradition in Minnesota of people showing a healthy suspicion for government. That's fine. You don't have to take my word for it. Go to court, but bring your evidence, bring facts, right? Bring witnesses. You can't just go because you have a hunch or a vibe or a bad feeling. But if you don't like the result of an election and you think someone was up to no good, the courthouse doors are always open, as we found in 2020, where by the dozens, state and federal courts, with judges appointed by both political parties, found almost unanimously that there was nothing there to the allegations of any widespread or serious misconduct.
All right, great. Thank you. Well, we've used up our hour tonight, and so I'd like to close just by thanking you both. Deirdre Schifeling from the Civil Liberties Union, Secretary of State Steve Simon, thank you so much for helping us get to the bottom of this issue. And everyone in the audience tonight who joined us tonight, thank you so much for paying attention to the issue, for supporting Clean Elections Minnesota. And with that, I'll say good night.